bring on today our hostess for today's program, Mae Charles.
Hi, boys and girls, moms and dads. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Today, reading book 2. It's called Cattle Are Restless. And it's very exciting with lots of parts and brand new characters from last week. Before I start, I'm going to say hello again to all the children at the daycare at the Miramar Marine Base in San Diego, and to Surrey and her mom in Houston, who sent me a lovely email telling me how much they loved last week's show, excuse me, and plan to tune in again today. So if everybody's ready, let's begin. This is the story of Gus, the sheriff of Pecos, a small town in Texas, which is also the home of the Lone Ranger and Davy Crockett. He's known as Good Gus because he always does the right thing. He's a good sheriff because he looks after Pecos and all its people. It was a gorgeous sunny day in Pecos, Texas. Gus had just finished his rounds on Main Street and was heading south today to check on the families who lived outside of town. That was his job, to make sure the town and its people were safe, including those folks who lived a little ways out of the town itself. He had finished a big breakfast at Mary's Cafe. Mary and her husband Fred, with their 2 boys, J.C. and Jimmy Ray, had moved to Pecos in the spring. They liked Pecos so much that they decided to stay and opened a cafe. Mary served a delicious breakfast and a very tasty dinner as well. She was closed at lunchtime so she could look after her 2 children and tend to her small garden. Mary was a very pleasant person who always had a smile on her face. Her husband Fred worked with Ray, the blacksmith, and between the 2 of them, they kept all the horses shoed in and around Pecos. Ray, as the blacksmith, made all the horse shoes out of the iron, and Fred, as the farrier, put the shoes on horses' hoofs using square nails. They both loved working with the hot furnace and had begun trying out new ways to bend metal and make items. Some of the townspeople would come in with their ideas of wanting something such as a tool for gardening or for tending crops. Fred and Ray would then go right to work for them. Most of the time, they came up with good ideas and made interesting items that really did the job. Excuse me. On this beautiful September day, a stranger rode into town. He was wearing a bright red shirt, black jeans, chaps, black boots, and a big black Stetson hat. He was riding a shiny black horse. He didn't look like Bad Bart, but people were nervous the moment they saw the black horse. The stranger seemed to know exactly where to go. He pulled up in front of the sheriff's office and tied his horse to the hitching post. Fred was walking to the cafe to eat lunch with Mary and the boys. When Fred saw him and said, "Howdy," the stranger said, "Howdy," and started to walk towards Sheriff Gus's office. Fred said, "If you're looking for Gus, he's out checking the families south of the town and won't be back for a few hours." By this time, the stranger began walking back towards Fred. Fred wasn't afraid because the cowboy had a pleasant look on his face. The stranger then said, "Hi, my name is Corey. Do you know where I can get a bite to eat?" Fred said, "Normally at Mary's Cafe, but she doesn't serve lunch." "Where are you from?" Corey replied, "I'm from Fort Worth. I'm Gus's cousin. I've come to Pecos to help Joe Kelly drive his cattle to Fort Worth next month." Fred replied, "Well, I'm very happy to meet you, and I have great news. Now, Corey, if you'll come home with me, we'll fix your hungry stomach right up. Corey smiled a really big smile and said, "Why, thank you, but you never told me your name." Fred smiled back and said, "I'm Fred Band, and Mary is my wife. I work with her in the early morning at the cafe, and then I work down at the blacksmith's with Ray in the afternoon." Fred led Corey around to the back of the cafe and then into his house, where Fred immediately introduced Corey as Gus's cousin. Corey received a hearty welcome and was almost a little glad Gus wasn't around. He was really enjoying himself. Mary put an extra plate on the table, and Corey ate with the Bands. He thought to himself, "This is mighty fine food, better than I eat in Fort Worth." After lunch, around 2:30, Fred went back to work at the blacksmith shop, and Corey walked down Main Street with him. Just as they reached the blacksmith's, Gus rode into town. Gus knew instantly that it was his cousin. He was the only cowboy he had ever met that wore a red shirt. Gus was really happy to see Corey. It had been over 2 years since they last saw each other. Fred introduced Ray to Corey, and then Gus and Corey walked to the sheriff's office. When Gus tied up Coco, his dark brown horse with the white streak on his face, he saw Corey's horse Midnight, who turned his head and whinnied a hello at Gus. Gus and Corey went into the sheriff's office and talked for a long time. Finally, they went around to the back of the jail and into Gus's home. Once they settled down, Gus made barbecue for supper. I love barbecue. Do you? And they both went to sleep because they had a big day coming up. The next morning, after Gus's rounds, Corey and Gus headed to Joe's ranch. Naturally, when they arrived, Joe was happy to see them both. He didn't know that they were cousins. Gus had a good visit with Joe and his family, and then headed back to town. He had made Corey promise to come into town and say goodbye before the cattle drive next month. 3 weeks slipped by before Corey returned to town. Everyone now knew that Corey was Gus's cousin. So, as he moseyed down Main Street, all the townspeople said hello to him. Corey thought to himself, what a nice town, and what really friendly people. Corey went directly to Gus's office and had another long visit. Corey said goodbye and told Gus he'd try to come back soon. The following Monday, Joe and Corey began getting the cattle ready for the drive. They packed a wagon with plenty of food, blankets, pots and pans, cups, and silverware. Joe had hired Old Tex to come along as the cook. Old Tex had been on many cattle drives, but he didn't want to do the hard work of driving the cattle, although he liked the trip. Corey and Joe rounded up all the cattle and drove them into the corral overnight. Tuesday morning, before the sun was up, Joe and Corey began heading out. Old Tex was in the rear with the supply wagon. Now, Joe's ranch was about 10 miles outside of Pecos, so that by the time they were approaching the edge of town, the sun was up and people were going about their daily lives. All of a sudden, one of the cattle was startled by a prairie dog. He started drifting off, so Corey yelled to Joe he had to get him. Pretty soon, several cows were heading off the trail and moving at a very fast pace. This made Corey very nervous because as the cattle began heading towards town, they might stampede. Okay, boys and girls, we're going to take a break while my friend Leo talks to you. But during the break, think about what might happen. Do you think cattle will stampede the town? Do you think everyone will be safe? Who will save the day? I'll be back in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
What an interesting story we have going on here today. You're listening to Mae's Story Time with the narrator for the program and the author of the book, Mae Charles, right here in the studio. I want to let you know that you can order a copy of these stories for your children and schools. You're welcome to call in and the libraries from around the world, anywhere, to order copies of this book so that you have a lot of selections available for the children in your classrooms. You can simply call the studio at 1-888-778-1436 or 364-5400 if you're locally here in Las Vegas. Also, I want to let you know that these stories are available on DVD or audio CD. The price of the DVDs are $15 and the audio CDs are $10. And 50% of the proceeds goes to support the program to the hostess of the show. Again, you can either click on order a copy of the show at the top of the viewing portal you're watching, or call us at the studio, 364-5400.